Detective Mamadou Gondo was on the witness stand. One of the biggest moments came during cross-examination when he said that Detective Souter stole money from people as part of a specialized unit about a decade prior. He didn't provide much other detail about that. Souter was killed on November 15th, the day before he was scheduled to testify in a grand jury about this very case. His killing remains unsolved to this day. Now, Detective Gondo was on the gun trace task force. Souter was not a part of the gun trace task force, but two of the detectives on trial here today are Detective Daniel Herschel and Detective Marcus Taylor. Now, Gondo talked about the overtime fraud. He talked about selling drugs, although he said he didn't consider himself a drug dealer. He had a close personal relationship, a childhood friend who was a heroin dealer, and he had several times tipped him off to police activities. And he also said he became aware that he was being wiretapped by the FBI, and they were playing in court some of those wiretapped calls. He said he did what he did out of greed. He talked about splitting up money, some $17,000, with Detective Herschel and Wayne Jenkins, who was the leader of this gun unit. And he talked about how he had been involved in stealing, dating back to his time joining the specialized squad, the VSID, back around 2008. And that goes back to his allegation about Detective Souter. Defense attorneys have tried to say that he is simply not credible. Cross-examination continues after the lunch break, and we'll update you on WJZ.
Bail bondsman Donald Stepp detailed the amount of drugs stolen and sold by members of the Baltimore Police Gun Trace Task Force. He claimed he was the seller. In his testimony in the federal racketeering trial of former Detective Daniel Herschel and Marcus Taylor, he told jurors about his ties to former gun squad Sergeant Wayne Jenkins. Jenkins pleaded guilty to multiple charges in the case. Stepp described how Jenkins viewed the department and his assignment. Jenkins saw the GTTF as a front for a criminal enterprise that gave him free rein over the entire city, the cream of the crop of officers, and put the whole city at his disposal, Stepp said. He also testified Jenkins described former gun squad Detective Daniel Herschel as one of the most corrupt cops in Baltimore City. Stepp also testified Herschel shared in the proceeds of drug sales totaling more than $1 million, and Jenkins would drop off drugs stolen from dealers in raids at Stepp Bowley's Quarters house for storage until sale. And he said during the April 2015 unrest, Jenkins dropped off 2 trash bags of pills taken from looters. Jenkins said, "I just got people coming out of these places. I've got an entire pharmacy." Stepp also implicated former Detective Marcus Taylor in the robbery of 30 pounds of marijuana. And as the defense questioned Stepp, he admitted he had a history of fraud. Stepp previously pleaded guilty to federal drug charges. Now, trial resumes Monday, and lead investigative reporter Jane Miller will be here to cover that. Reporting live from downtown Baltimore, Barry Sims, WBAL-TV 11 News.
He made $1 million selling drugs for former police officers.
And this bail bondsman's testimony implies the corruption went even deeper than the officers who were charged. ABC2 investigative reporter Brian Kubler joins us now live with what was said in the courtroom today.
Kelly, a friend and accomplice of Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, took the stand today and delivered yet another day of explosive testimony in this case. Donald Stepp, a close Jenkins family friend and bail bondsman, told the jury that Wayne Jenkins told him the gun trace task force was, quote, a front for a criminal enterprise. Stepp admitted to being part of the enterprise, telling the jury he sold the drugs Jenkins would steal. Since 2012, Stepp said he must have made more than $1 million pushing cocaine, crack, heroin, and even 2 trash bags full of prescription drugs Jenkins said he stole from looters during the 2015 riots. Stepp also testified how he was the man who supplied Jenkins with the clothes and heavy-duty tools he would use to rob big-time drug dealers in the city. Quick bags, he called them, filled with bolt cutters, crowbars, a machete, and this mask, all bought on Amazon. Stepp said he would provide, quote, a steady abundance of specialty equipment that they would need. Stepp, who participated in some of these robberies himself, described Jenkins as the prince of the Baltimore Police Department, who had the entire city at his disposal and the pick of the cream of the crop officer. But in addition to these 7 officers, Jenkins told Stepp there were, quote, other units, other officers steal. One name Stepp testified to was Sergeant Thomas Wilson, currently active in the BPD. He recalled one meeting with him, but then also implicated a Baltimore County police officer who was not named. Testimony today that begs the question for folks like Public Defender Debbie Levy, where does this corruption end? Do you start thinking, how far does this go out, how far does it go up, and where else does it go?
I mean, that's the only thought that I've got racing through my mind every day, all day, is where does it stop? How many officers, how many people's convictions are called into question for these officers' brazen and really egregious and horrible criminal conduct?
Now, Stepp was arrested and federally indicted last month for his role in all of this. He faces life in prison and is cooperating, obviously, in this case. Now, as the afternoon wore on, prosecutors continue to call more victims of these GTTF robberies, with more of a focus on Detective Daniel Herschel. And Officer Stepp testified Jenkins called, quote, one of the most corrupt cops in Baltimore City. This trial takes a break tomorrow and resumes on Monday morning. For now, we are live in downtown Baltimore. Brian Kubler, ABC 2 News.
Now we turn to a very important story, a suspicious killing of a police officer roiling the city of Baltimore tonight. No on-duty police officer has been killed in Baltimore in over a decade in a homicide until Detective Sean Souter was shot there. He was killed the day before he was scheduled to testify in a case against indicted Baltimore officers. Now this killing, done with the officer's gun, a single shot to the head in the afternoon, is drawing scrutiny and suspicion. Audio from that day suggests a confusing scene.
We do not know where these shots came from. We have officers in bad locations. Let everybody take cover somewhere, okay?
The very next day, the officer was supposed to testify in a case prosecuting other officers for stealing money and drugs as part of an allegedly corrupt police task force.
People want answers and the rumors are flying.
The murder happened just one day before he was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury against fellow officers accused of being in a rogue gun unit.
He was shot with his own gun during that shooting and also at very close range.
There is a legitimate suspect on the loose.
The bottom line of that, Sean Souter wasn't just a police officer who was shot and killed here. He was also a federal witness against other cops.
The Baltimore Police Commissioner is saying there's no link here between the killing and Souter's planned testimony.
The BPD and the FBI do not possess any information that this incident, and it appears to be nothing more than a spontaneous observation of a man behaving suspiciously and a spontaneous decision to investigate his conduct as part of any conspiracy. The evidence, in fact, refutes that notion.
In a moment, I'm going to speak with the former federal prosecutor Paul Butler, as well as U.S. Congresswoman Don Edwards, who previously represented Baltimore. I begin, though, with the Baltimore Sun's Justin Fenton, who has been on the story from the beginning. Justin, what happened here?
So Detective Souter was doing a follow-up investigation on a homicide from last year in West Baltimore. He was out there with a partner, and much of else what happened is unknown. He was shot with his own gun in the head, as he said. His weapon was recovered from the scene, but there's no video. There's no real suspect description. Authorities offered a $215,000 reward, and they don't really have any leads at the moment.
This all came out right in going into the Thanksgiving holiday. Why has the Baltimore police been so slow to provide information?
The police department said that they only learned of Detective Souter's role in that grand jury investigation the day before. Complicating things is that the rumors of that had been out in the community for days. And so on Thanksgiving Eve, they provided confirmation that this was going on. And I think that it's raised a lot of questions in the community. The police commissioners tried to say that they don't see any reason for a link. primarily because he was shot with his own weapon, in sort of a spontaneous encounter, which they say goes against any idea that he, was meeting up with somebody.
But if they don't have a suspect, they can't rule out that it wasn't spontaneous.
Right, and they've actually said many times that they can't rule a lot of things out. I think there's a medical examiner's ruling of a homicide, but even there's some questions there. They're saying that they're not ruling anything out. They're also resisting urges for a federal takeover of the investigation. Some have suggested that the FBI should be taking a lead role in this.
Well, given that there's a federal nexus with the problems around the impending case, that would be one thing to consider. Justin Fenton on the ground in Baltimore, thank you. I now turn to Paul Butler, who is the author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men, and former Congresswoman Donna Edwards, who, as I mentioned, represented Baltimore. Donna, I begin with you. Does this look suspicious?
Well, just for a correction, I actually didn't represent Baltimore, even though Maryland is a small state.
My apologies.
That's all right. I think that the citizens and residents of Baltimore certainly have reason to be suspicious given the circumstances. I'm going to take Chief Davis at his word. I've known him for many years. He actually used to represent the county that I live in. But there are a lot of questions raised here. And, good thing that, just a couple of months ago.
Let me ask you this. I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't know that it's about taking him at his word or not. I think it is that if this is an investigation of an unsolved killing and probably murder under the law, it seems suspect that he is already trying to rule things out when they don't have the information. He's not saying we're going to go wherever the facts lead. He seems to be actively taking a view of the case, that there wasn't any misconduct. Of course, this is alongside indictments of police misconduct.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I think that what Commissioner Davis was trying to do was really to still the environment around that area. That area actually immediately after Detective Souter's killing was in effect, sort of on lockdown. And there's a lot of suspicion in the community. I've been reading online, all the various theories and stories. And so I understand wanting to, quell the public and wait for the investigation to take them where it leads. But I have to tell you, given the history of some in the Baltimore Police Department, given the history of the department, that it's under a consent decree right now and just had a federal monitor appointed, I think there are a lot of reasons that people in Baltimore need to tread very carefully and ask the questions that need to be asked to get to the bottom of this, so that the community can be rest assured that there isn't just some random killer out there, and find the person who murdered Detective Souter.
Paul?
Yeah, so there are some simple investigative questions that we don't know the answer to. But where was Detective Souter's partner when this murder went down? Why does he have such a vague description of the assailant? They apparently engaged with this suspect about 20 minutes before the homicide. And what happened within that 20 minutes? Most of all, what is the motive? It's bizarre that the chief would exclude the fact that the next day this cop who's murdered was going to testify against other police officers in a police corruption investigation.
Right, Paul, let's pause on that point. Anytime you have an unsolved mystery, let alone a rare on-duty homicide, because as rough as Baltimore is, the direct attack and shooting of officers on duty is rare. As I mentioned, once a decade. This would seem like a potential motive to at least investigate, and yet police are already ruling it out.
It's almost the first thing that you would think about, given that Baltimore, unfortunately, has a long history of police corruption and a long history of a blue wall of silence, where police officers protect each other when they're implicated in crimes. And so that leads, again, to having to ask, is this related to his pending testimony? And Congresswoman Edwards is totally right that given the distrust between citizens and the police in Baltimore, when police use these aggressive tactics, like they put this neighborhood on lockdown for almost a week, you had to show ID to get into your own house, that actually makes it harder for the police to do their jobs because folks don't trust the police. Baltimore is where the Don't Be a Snitch movement started because of distrust. And again, that makes it harder for police to get to the bottom of serious homicides like this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC.